Devil May Cry is a series of games that revolve around the wisecrack half-human half-demon devil hunter Dante, who is perpetually broke and surviving on pizza, his brother Virgil, and the deadweight Nero. You would expect a sequel to the original Devil May Cry to improve and build upon the foundation of the first game and surpass it, which it did not. The game wasn't awesome, it wasn't super smug and sexy. Devil May Cry 2 is a black sheep of the Devil May Cry family because it is a really bad game and one of the worst games ever released for some pretty obvious reasons.
Dante is silent half the game and sounds depressed the other half. The movement is slow. The same goes for the combat, very slow and dull, where in previous games combos could be pulled off with the triangle button and putting small spaces in between the presses to pull off various combos. You instead press the directional stick L3 to pull off various combos, which is very awkward. And there's a lesser variety of weapons with just 4 swords and 3 range, and all the swords have the same moveset. You use the red orbs to increase the damage of your weapons and not to unlock movesets like in the previous games, which is kind of pointless. And the guns are too busted since you can solve the entire game just by shooting them. The enemy AI is just brained, like half their attacks don't even connect and most of the time they just stay in your vicinity. So your dodge is basically useless since you can simply walk to avoid getting hit. And the enemy health bar is too hard to read since it's a really transparent red combined with the game's murky visuals makes it hard to make out. Even the bosses can be solved by just your guns since they have the same brain dead AI, for example the Infest Chopper and Tank, with the rest of the bosses being just annoying to deal with and with the final boss being the only somewhat decent fight. And the level design is just barren and empty and they are longer than they should be with dull exploration, which ultimately makes the game a chore to get through.
Why? Why?
The sequel was greenlit by Capcom before the first game even came out, making it hard for the team since there was no feedback to rely on, like on what to improve and what to do. And the people working on the game had no idea on how to design a console-like game since the entire team was from Capcom's arcade division, people that normally design arcade games and have no experience in console-style gameplay, were reassigned to this project after a corporate restructuring due to the growing popularity of console games and dwindling arcade sales. Now, because of the lack of feedback, the team basically had an open canvas, and combined with the lack of direction, along with the fact that the producer was not a huge fan of Dante's wisecracking nature, which basically contributed to Dante's silent depressed attitude, and with only 6 months left for the game to be released, Capcom higher-ups realized the project was going nowhere, so they hired director Hideki Itsuno, replacing the previous director, to salvage the game, making it the playable state it is.
2 lines means pregnant.
This thing's pretty old. How do you know?
And here.
And here's a couple more. So we're having a baby. I mean, we and also, I guess, Jesse here. It was Jesse, right? So we're all having a baby. Holy shit. I'm gonna be a dad.
Yeah.
The Last of Us is one of the best stories told in the medium of gaming, so naturally people expect the sequel to surpass or be just as good as the original, which The Last of Us Part 2 spectacularly failed at. It was one of the most controversial game launches in history, with important plot elements like Joel's death being leaked early. Reviewers disliked the game with just how terrible the story was, and critics, they glazed the shit out of it. Even though most critical, a guy who has a really monotone voice sounded pretty agitated when reviewing the game. The main problem with the game wasn't the gameplay, it was the story, which was nowhere near the quality of the first one. The story is so contrived and emotionally manipulative, all to do with the message that revenge is bad, which Neil Druckmann failed at pretty well. Well, for several reasons. One of the main reasons being the way they handled Joel's death and how out of character some of the characters like Joel and Tommy behaved. Now, Joel and Tommy are seasoned veterans of post-apocalyptic world. Now, Joel was someone who was able to sense an ambush from a mile away, and Tommy is also similarly skilled, and served in the Fireflies with Marlene. And he is also one of the leaders of Jackson. For some reason, when they magically appear out of nowhere, rescuing Abby and her friends, and then they just happen to reveal their names, which ended with Joel after getting his skull getting caved in by Abby. The other issue is Abby. She is a terrible character in terms of both her writing and design. Now, in terms of her design, she has this absurdly muscular build, which given the world is this post-apocalyptic landscape where resources are scarce, where the effort required to maintain and build a physique like hers is hard to find as quantities, it just really takes you out of the immersion of that world. And the other issue is also her writing, which really tries to make the player sympathize with Abby by making you play as her for 12 hours in the other half of the game, and it doesn't really do any good because it happens so late into the game. And by then, it's too late because there is no real character growth when compared to Ellie. We see the emotional and physical toll it has taken on her. She is unraveling as the story goes on, but Abby, she just remains the same. Even the parts where she is with Lev doesn't make up for how terrible she is. She doesn't feel remorse for any of the lives she has taken. Whenever Abby loses someone, she is upset at the beginning, but right after that, they're an afterthought. They're never brought up again, and there is no mention of them afterwards, which I said earlier. When you play as her, you're forced to pet the dogs, which the player as Ellie where you were forced to kill, since there was no choice in the confrontation. And in the confrontation between Abby, Ellie, and Dina, and Abby had Dina in a chokehold, Ellie begged Abby to not kill her, telling her that she is pregnant. And Abby, hearing that, relished the idea of killing Dina and was about to until Lev shows up, which is throws whatever goodwill Abby had as a character. She seemingly had no problem bringing in a pregnant woman alongside her, ultimately resulting in her and her babies at Ellie's end. Even the death of her friends is partly on her, since she's the one who dragged them into this mess. And she sleeps with Owen when he has Mel, who is pregnant with his child. And it's just things like this and that just makes Abby unredeemable in the eyes of a lot of players because of how terrible the writing is. Like, it doesn't really do a whole lot of effort to actually try and make her look good. And the game forces you to like her despite these obvious shortcomings of her character. The next issue is just how contrived and how poorly structured the narrative is. Like I said earlier, how Joel and Tommy appear out of nowhere and then switch off their common sense, with Tommy blurring out their names and Joel just standing there like an idiot. After which, hilarity ensued, and completely ruining Abby's chance at a redemption is one of the few examples of just how contrived the narrative is. It's also the way how the narrative wants to paint Ellie and Joel in a negative light and Abby in a positive light. The game retcons some of the previous events of the final stage of the previous game. Like when you compare the scene of Ellie on the operating table in part 1, the operating room is dingy and dirty. The lighting is a sickly green tone. The doctor that stands in between Joel from saving Ellie looks disheveled. His gown is grimy and he's wearing hiking boots in the OR. The IV bag looks really dirty, and combined with the fact that as we fight through countless firefly to get to Ellie, we come across notes indicating how Ellie was the only person who was immune to be on that operating table, but for the resulting surgery to be a complete failure. But when compared to the flashbacks in part 2, the OR isn't dirty or has a sickly green tone. It's clean. The doctor, who we later learn is Abby's dad, looks completely different. He's wearing white sneakers like he should. His gown doesn't look as grimy. The IV bag is clean. In the scene, Joel is talking to Tommy. Druckmann portrays Joel to be some sort of monster with what happened at the hospital. In another flashback, that Dr. Jerry says how the cure is within reach and asserts this fact to Marlene, even when we find records that contradicts this. The entire point of this retcon has two but primarily one purpose: to vilify Joel and to justify Abby's revenge to the player. The story tries to manipulate you into feeling guilty through these forced interactions, and the two prime examples of this is you murking the dogs and Mel, who is pregnant. The game really tries to make you feel guilty over your act of killing them, but it's just done so cheaply. Like when it comes to the dogs, it's really hard to avoid killing them and you have no choice but to kill them. Later, when we play as Abby, we learn those same dogs we kill are now good boys, and the game forces you to play fetch with them, forcing the player to feel bad for killing a dog when it's a life or death situation. Next, with Mel's death, the way it played out is kind of dumb. After Ellie tracked Abby to the last place she was in, which was the aquarium, except for Abby who had already left the place by the time Ellie reached there, the only people that were there were Mel and Owen. Ellie came in, guns blazing, asking where Abby is at gunpoint. She showed a map to Mel to point out where she went with Owen, telling her not to say anything, trying to cover for Abby instead of prioritizing his unborn child. Ellie, getting agitated, points the gun towards Mel. Owen then lunges towards Ellie and the gun goes off, shooting Owen, and Mel, being distraught, tries to kill Ellie with a knife, lunging at her till Ellie overpowered her and stuck the knife in her throat. But it was too late till she realized Mel was pregnant after moving the coat, which conveniently enough Mel wasn't wearing before at the aquarium. This really sickened Ellie, traumatizing her even further with what she had done. The point Neil is trying to make with her killing animals and pregnant women is how Ellie is being consumed by revenge and slowly becoming a monster. But the thing is, she feels genuine remorse for the terrible things she has done. We see the emotional and physical toll it has taken on her body and the PTSD she suffers later on. But Abby, on the other hand, relished about taking Dina's life after learning she was pregnant. She doesn't show any remorse over the things she has done. The game forces you to like her when forcing you to hate Ellie. The next annoying issue, and especially the biggest one, is the ending. After Abby beats up Ellie and Dina, they are shown sometime later on a farm, with Dina having given birth to a child, living together peacefully and raising the child together with Ellie, and with Abby captured and suffering the consequences of her actions. Now, this would have been a perfect ending, since the entire point of the story is to show why revenge is bad. Sometimes the best thing to do is to let go or forgive. Then came Tommy with a small request to Ellie to basically abandon her newfound peace and family to again hunt down Abby. Why Tommy decided to go after her after all this time, I don't know. Why is he flip-flopping from Ellie, eating words to Ellie, let's go kill that bitch, I don't know. Then Ellie once again decides to go on a killing rampage, leaving Dina behind for some reason. Even after her last confrontation didn't teach her anything about Abby, she then proceeds to kill half a city's worth of people to free Abby, who at this point was rotting away in a prison, which was exactly what she deserved, and then frees her, and they get into this really brutal, visceral fistfight that just devolves into more and more barbarity. Ellie gets her fingers bit off, and then when she finally gets the upper hand, she stops because of some stupid vision she had about Joel, and then she spares her. She lets her go along with Discount Ellie into the sunset. And when Ellie gets home, there's no Dina waiting for her. She can't play guitar. That was her only connection to Joel. In the end, she's left with nothing, and she's all alone. This entire segment is contrived and unnecessary. The story could have been wrapped up at the farm where Ellie gets the happy ending she deserves with Dina, and Abby gets her the karma she actually deserves. There's a line from the first game, it can't be for nothing. The first game played with this in that while the original goal of journeying with Ellie across the country was not accomplished, both Joel and Ellie ended up better off than they were, and found unexpected hope in a bleak world. But instead, here it was all for nothing. Ellie lost everyone and the one connection she had with Joel. The ending easily highlights the game's biggest flaw, how contrived it is. Men wanted to hammer home why revenge is bad and how it's an endless cycle without any sort of tact or subtlety. Killing of Joel right in the beginning, recounting events from the first game, forcing the player to sympathize with Abby, manipulating players emotionally, characters being out of character, all made for a jarring, emotionally draining experience that doesn't even hold a candlelight to the first game. Now, contrary to popular belief or what Neil wants you to believe, The Last of Us wasn't created by just one person. It also had a co-creator by the name of Bruce Straley. While most of the ideas were created by Neil, he tended to be overly dark at the expense of the story, which was where Bruce Straley came in. Although to what extent is unknown, he was able to tame those elements. Neil originally wanted to create a Ren story with Straley reeling him in, which resulted in the creation of the first Last of Us, critical acclaim, with Neil being regarded as a great storyteller and a promotion. During the development of Uncharted 4, Amy Hennig was unceremoniously fired for unknown reasons, after which Neil took over the game and reworked it from the beginning, after which resulted in the brutal crunch, where 70% of the employees and Bruce Straley left due to burnout, and Neil was promoted to VP for some reason, giving him full creative control, and this let him create the game he always wanted to, which was how Part 2 came into being, with all his rejected ideas being put into this oven, and with no one to act as a control rod, all of his worst tendencies came out, which resulted in the absolute shit show that is The Last of Us Part 2.
Amazing. A booby trap that actually catches boobies.
Transformers is a long storied franchise that has been around for nearly 40 years, ever since the launch of the Diaclone figures in Japan and the 84 G1 series. Since then, there have been countless TV shows, movies, and games, and two of the most notable Transformers games are Transformers War for Cybertron and Transformers Fall of Cybertron. Now, both were absolutely bug-smashing, swashbuckling, amazing games made by a talented and loyal dev team that improved on each iteration of those games. The gameplay is inspired by Gears of War, but instead of being power-based where you actually transform into a vehicle, they have an amazing score and art direction, and best of all, the games actually take place on Cybertron and not on Earth, which is actually kind of awesome. So naturally, one would assume the third game to be just as amazing, but thanks to the wild machinations of the wild Goblin King Bobby Limdick, that game wasn't developed by the studio that put so much love and passion into these games. Instead, it was developed by a studio that was a bunch of fucking nobodies, and worst of all, it was a half-ass movie tie-in that was somehow supposed to work. This is Transformers Rise of the Darkspark. The game is just a mess. While the story takes place in two universes, the High Moon and the Bayverse, while they don't overlap, the only thing connecting them is the MacGuffin, the Darkspark. While on paper the concept of the Darkspark is interesting, it is nothing more than a plot device. And speaking of the plot, the story is really mediocre and dull, since the entire story can be boiled down to getting the MacGuffin away from the bad guy. The story in the first two games, while having a really simple plot, it was still an amazing narrative experience, while this just feels like a chore. The Cybertron levels were just a rehash of Fall of Cybertron's assets, like the Chaos Outskirts, which is a heavily modified version of the Energon Transfer Carrier level, where you play as Bruticus in both. The textures were literally copy-pasted from Fall of Cybertron and just randomly pasted, like over here for example. The level design in general is lacking. There are hallways that are just empty. The art direction is awful. The environments are dull and barren. The game looks uglier and really hard on your eyes. This is true especially for the Earth segments. The environments are so generic and terribly designed, it is literally just splotches of brown and green, and the most generic texture packs made with the least amount of effort. Even the music is the exact same as the one in Fall of Cybertron except for the menu. The gameplay is once again just a copy and paste of Fall of Cybertron, except it's way worse. The gameplay is terribly balanced. You can die in like 4 shots despite having a shield, and that gives you a chance to die great. Whereas in the previous games, you don't just immediately die after getting shot. You get the exact same weapons ported right over from Fall of Cybertron, and they work the exact same, except you unlock new weapons by opening your boxes, basically loot boxes where you don't have to pay for them, but you had to complete various challenges to unlock them. The game is super buggy and unoptimized. You get random loading screens out of nowhere. Sometimes you clip right through the environment, falling to pitch black and stuck in space. And the other glaring issue is the continuity errors that are rampant in these games. Megatron somehow being in his new body, considering the game takes place before Fall of Cybertron, and Trypticon somehow being in Chaos instead of him being out of our hands, since we literally invade the place where Trypticon is being kept as prisoner. The most blatant of these errors are in the Bayverse segments, because it literally fits nowhere in the timeline of Optimus and Bumblebee's design. Lockdowns and Grimlocks are present since boy characters first appear in AoE, so the story as a whole isn't canon to the movies, and prepare to be tortured with
Let's see what we got. Let's see what we got. What?
Since Activision had access to a bunch of licenses that were about to expire, and those morons in their infinite wisdom seeing the success of the Cybertron games made High Moon develop a Deadpool game, hoping that they could make their game just as successful and handle the development of the third installment to Edge of Reality, whose previous endeavors were basically porting games to the N64 like Tony Hawk and Monster Truck Madness, and a few licensed games, The Incredible Hulk and Shark Tale, and they had to make this game in like 6 months time, which explains why the game is the way it is. And what made this worse is the fact that they had to port the game for every single platform, and this being a cross-gen PS4, PS3 game, and with its release having to coincide with the movie, basically explains why this game was a mess it turned out to be. Unlike most of the games on this list that are disliked for being garbage, it's short to play through, a buggy mess, and having an awful story, and overall just being disappointing, Dark Souls 2 is the game that tends to stick out because it's considered by some people the worst Souls game ever made, and by other people's as the best game ever made. Now, whenever people have extreme opinions about something, the truth usually lies somewhere in the middle. Now, Dark Souls 2 is not a bad game, but it is not the best Souls game either. Like, whenever people rank Souls games, it is often placed at the bottom right under Demon Souls, and for a good reason. Souls games, while being difficult, it's still a fair game, where every death is a bloody experience, but with this game, it has a few things that makes the game unnecessarily hard and being unfair to the player to list them out. Adaptability. It's a stat that primarily affects your dodge or the iframes, which states how long you'll be invincible when you dodge. You start with a small amount of iframes, leaving you a narrow window and having to time every single dodge perfectly, and each time you upgrade the stat, you are forced to relearn since the timing changes every upgrade. Now this stat wasn't there in Dark Souls 1 since you started the game with max iframes. It was only implemented in Dark Souls 2 and no other Souls game has implemented this since. The next is the health cap. Each time you die, your HP decreases till it reaches 50% of your max HP, which is capped till you burn a human effigy. The effigy is also a multiplayer item, so use it carefully. Then there is the negative stamina. When you swing a weapon and it costs more stamina than you have in your stamina bar, that exact amount will still be used going into the negatives or below the stamina bar, which if it does, it takes time to recover from that negative point, leaving you unable to retaliate, placing you at a disadvantage. When it comes to gameplay, your character movement appears to be janky because you can only move in 8 directions and they just snap to like each direction. The lock-on system is stupid, like when locked onto the enemy and you're walking in a direction opposite to where the enemy is at, your weapon will swing in the direction your joystick is pointed at and the enemy requires you to be the lock-on requires you to be close to the enemy to place a lock-on, which is inconvenient. The even more annoying issue is the aggro range. Like when you're in the aggro range of an enemy and you leave this range, they follow you indefinitely till you meet some invisible threshold that stops the enemy, which makes boss runs really annoying since they can follow you into the boss room. The character hurt box is at times terrible, like when you're right next to a boss weapon after the attack, you flip into the weapon when the weapon clearly didn't even touch or get damage by moves that didn't even connect with your hitbox. That just takes too long to heal, and the level design makes no sense. Like sometimes like taking the elevator in Earthen Peak and goes up to the lava-filled volcanic area. The enemies have a respawn limit which makes farming really hard, but that is kind of why the bonfire aesthetic was added. The enemy placements are just awful, with it being really tight clusters ambushing you out of nowhere.
Why?
After the success of Dark Souls 1, Namco wanted a sequel as soon as possible, but Miyazaki was busy creating the Artorias of the Abyss DLC, so Namco assigned direction to Tomohiro Shibuya to direct the sequel. Now Shibuya was pretty ambitious. He wanted to surpass the original game in every single way, especially in the graphics department. He wanted to create a new engine early in development to create this photorealistic open world game with amazing lighting effects, which raises several red flags. Creating a completely new game engine from scratch during development and wanting to achieve high graphical fidelity with advanced lighting is going to be hard when working on 17 consoles like the PS3 and 360, which is exactly what happened with it overloading the systems and making the consoles overheat to death. And sometime in 2013, From Software took a look at the state of the game and realized they weren't even halfway done, so they removed Shibuya and placed Yui Tanamura as the director. Now Tanamura quickly realized that the entire engine had to be retooled since it wasn't suitable at all. He also had to rewrite parts of the lore and redesign assets, and making use of already developed assets in a short time. It also required him to cut up the open world map into a standard Assaults map within a short period of time, which is why the game is the mess it is known as.